Welcome everybody. We're going to start talking about elongated fishes. I'm a big fan of eel puns, and any grad student who works within the field of fish biology would love to make eel puns with you. So there are many lunch breaks in biology labs where we're playing around with funny eel songs. So to get us started, just to give us a quick background on who we're talking about from a macro scale. Fishes, they're our oldest bony relatives. So we're not talking about cuttlefish, we're not talking about jellyfish, bones. And right here we've got an x-ray of a moray eel, which is actually pretty cool. There are two big groups of fishes. You have the ray-finned fishes and the cartilaginous fishes. And the ray-finned fishes have, as you can see, fins with rays or these bony spines in them. And that's the group that we're talking about. Also included in the big category of fish are the cartilaginous fishes, like sharks and rays and skates. And we're not talking about those guys, but the ray-finned fish. And there's a huge amount of diversity within fish. They have over 30,000 species, which is more than any other grouping of animals. So there are more fish than there are mammals or reptiles or birds. Once you get into invertebrates, that's a different story, but as far as vertebrates go, they have an enormous range in size and weight. And here I have pictured the mola mola, who weighs the equivalent amount to a white rhino. So I'm excited to go through some of these really weird guys with you today. First off, you may not know, fish can smell. So fishes, they use their eyesight, they can taste, they can smell. They have a system that we don't have called the lateral line system, where they can feel vibrations in the water. But eels in particular have a really, really strong sense of smell and rely on it quite a bit. So if you're looking up really close at the nose of a fish, you'll see two little holes kind of on the bottom of the nose and two little holes on the top of the nose. And in the eels, those where the water flows in, or the anterior nares, and the posterior nares, where the water flows out, are quite a distance from each other. A lot of fish, they're right next to each other, kind of like how our nostrils are right next to each other. And what this means is that because the space in between the in-current and ex-current parts of the eel's nose is so big, it can pack a lot of sensory cells to smell things. So it's consistently in the literature, eels are cited as having one of the most developed senses of smells. And here we can see on the left-hand side of the page, on the bottom, that's kind of a close-up view of what the inside of a fish's nose looks like. It almost looks like gills. It's got a lot of these folds and valleys. And what that does is it's a lot of surface area for cells that are sensory cells to live. So the more of that surface area you have, the more amount of smell you can do. Basically, the stronger your sense of smell. So we can see on the right-hand side of the page, the only fish that was kind of recognizable from that list of fish was the salmon. You can see that they don't have very many folds. They don't have a lot of surface area where those sensory cells can live, whereas eels have a lot. They have twice as many as the one who's next on the list. So freshwater eels, saltwater eels, really, really developed sense of smell, and that's why the gap between their in-current nostril and their ex-current nostril is so big. It's for all of that sensory cells to sit. So it's kind of like how if you look at a critter, a fish, or a mammal or anything with really big eyes, they have really giant eyes because they rely on their sight so much. So it's kind of like the eel has a really giant nose because they rely on their smell so much. And as a trade-off, their eyesight is pretty terrible. So only a couple of eels hunt in the day, and we'll be talking about that, but most of them hunt at night, which is why it makes sense for them to have a really good sense of smell. And it's also why if you see them hunting around for food, they're sticking their heads inside coral heads, and they almost seem to be blundering around a little bit because they're not really seeing where they're going. They're relying on that smell. So to start off, we're going to talk about, there are three big groups of eels that we have here in Hawaii. First off, we're going to start off with the moray eels. And we have here 42 species in Hawaii. They're the second most numerous group in Hawaii, second to wrasses. So there are many, many species of wrasses, and then morays, and then I don't know who's after morays in terms of the number of species we have here. The Hawaiian name for morays is the puhi. So a lot of the names for the morays, different species, is just puhi, and sometimes it has a little extra bit that describes the puhi a little bit more. General features of the morays, they're very elongated. They don't have any scales because scales are rough and can catch on corals and the rocky stuff that they're swimming through. So they're very smooth, they're covered in mucus. They don't have any paired fins. So the pectoral fins that flap around up here and the pelvic fins that are below on the fish, they don't have either of those. They have a really, really long larval stage, which is one of the reasons why we have so many of them. If you guys know about fish dispersal from the Indo-Pacific, right? You have a lot of, all the fish that we have came from the Indo-Pacific, and they had to drift out to Hawaii on the currents. And so if you can last as a larvae drifting around in the water for a really long time, you're more likely to land in Hawaii. If you only spend 2 days as a larva drifting around, you're not going to make it over here because you're not going to drift from some island in the Indo-Pacific to Hawaii in 2 days. If you can last 80 days, like morays can, then that makes sense. You might make it over here. They feed on a variety of foods, from fish to mollusks to crustaceans. They're kind of described as being vacuum cleaners or cleanup crews on the reef. So first, to start, one of the coolest features of morays are their pharyngeal jaws. So all fishes have pharyngeal jaws. You have the main set of jaws, which is on the outside, like this guy right here. And then you have a second set of jaws or bony plates that's in the throat of the fish. And depending on if that fish eats other fish or hard-shelled things, they'll be a different shape. Sometimes they're used just for crushing and grinding, like if you eat clams or something like that. But every fish has 1 pair and 2 pairs of jaws. Moray eels are really cool because their pharyngeal jaws are a slingshot mechanism, basically. So when they open their mouth, it slings forward and it can grab food that they're holding with their primary jaws and pull it back into their throat. So here on an x-ray, you can actually see where the pharyngeal jaws sit while the moray's primary jaws are closed. And when the jaws are open, the pharyngeal jaws come forward and are ready to help pull prey deeper inside the eel. Now, why would the eel do this? And this is kind of related to our apple bobbing question, right? Some of you said, well, I would suction feed. I would just open my mouth really big and suck the apples into my mouth. And like we learned about with scorpion fish last week, that's what a lot of fish use, and it's what trumpetfish use. But moray eels don't have a lot of space. If you're living inside a really tight reef and you have to eat somebody, you don't have room to expand your mouth to be really big. So what can you do? Well, I guess you can adapt to have this second set of jaws sling forward and grab and pull the prey item you just grabbed deeper into your mouth. That doesn't require any expansion. You can do it in a really tight space. And what's actually kind of cool is if you look at 2 different families within moray eels, they have 2 different mechanisms, like different muscles are being used. So it's possible that this mechanism, this pharyngeal jaw slinging forward, evolved twice independently, which is totally crazy. That's possible. It could have also diverged. I don't quite know, but it's clearly very beneficial for the morays. And here you can actually see them. So this is a green moray out in the Caribbean, and that thing that looks like a tongue that's coming out on the bottom of his mouth is actually his pharyngeal jaws. And if you look really close, you can see that they've got spiny teeth on them. But you can see the whole second set of jaws coming out right into his mouth. So imagine you got bit by something and then this other pair of jaws comes and grabs you and pulls you all the way in. It's totally inspired Alien. So next time you see Alien, thank the moray eels because that's where it came from. We actually did a little science video on this. So here's a kind of human example of we have the primary jaws that come forward and then the pharyngeal jaws go ahead and grab and pull the fish all the way into the moray eel's belly. Next, another cool feature of morays is their mating behaviors. So here we have the male who's light colored and up front, and the female, and he's enticing her to mate, and it's a little bit violent. The male usually bites on to the female's mouth, and then we don't actually see the full thing here because they kind of go swimming haywire. It's a little bit chaotic. But what happens is when they are mating, they mate in pairs. They'll hang out together for a while, and when it's the time, the male will kind of nudge her, nudge her, nudge her. He'll try grabbing her, he'll try grabbing her, and eventually they'll swim out, and the female will release her eggs and the male will release his sperm, and then the eggs are fertilized and carried up in the water column and can spend quite some time developing. So if you're ever out there and you see morays acting like this, doing this little dance, pay attention because something really cool could happen next. Now, when those little moray eggs finally hatch, they make this really cool larval form that's called a leptocephalus larva. And leptocephalus, if you break that name down, it means leaf head, because the head is really flat and kind of looks like a leaf, and the rest of the body is really transparent and thin so that you can barely see it. And it's a really unique looking larvae, and this is a leptocephalus larva of a ribbon eel. And it doesn't even look like a fish. If you look really closely, that little spot at the very front, that is the head of the little eel. And you can actually see his jaws, they're kind of stuck open. It looks like he's like, just like all these eels are. And the ribbon eel, of course, is very unique for having a very long ribbony body. So this is kind of an extreme form of the leptocephalus larva, but that's what they look like to some extent. It's really incredible to me that something that transparent is alive. Like, that's all living tissue. How does it, I don't even know how that works or why that evolved. It's totally wacko. And this guy can live in this leptocephalus larval form for a really long period of time, again, and that's why they could make their way over to Hawaii in the numbers that they could. One other thing that moray eels do that's more commonly seen for behavior is cooperative hunting. So a couple of morays will hunt during the daytime, and they won't hunt alone. Morays are really good at winding through the reef and getting fish that are hiding down inside. And groupers and trumpetfish and jacks have found out that if they hang out above where the moray eel is hunting, then little fish that are in the reef will get scared, swim out straight into the mouths of the predators waiting above. And the predators waiting above may also scare fish down into the reef to the moray, who will then happily gobble them up because they thought they were running away from a grouper right into the mouth of a moray eel. This is sometimes called cooperative hunting. It's also sometimes called, I forget what else. Cooperative kind of sounds like they said, hey, let's gang up and let's go hunt some fish together. I don't think it's like that. I don't actually know how much the moray eel benefits. Like, I can see that groupers get, X% more fish in their bellies from hunting with morays, but I don't know if morays actually are benefiting from this. So it definitely doesn't hurt them, that's for sure. But this is something that is seen, this is here in the Caribbean. We see it in Hawaii, you see it in the Indo-Pacific. It must be a learned behavior or innate, I'm not quite sure. But it's really cool that you can see it all over the planet. Morays are voracious predators. Here we have a moray who has found an octopus. And yes, it's sad because we love octopus, but it's really incredible to see this moray eel trying to get him. Here he's tying himself in a knot. And by tying himself in a knot, he has more leverage to pull against the reef to get the octopus. He'll also flip his body around in circles. It's really incredible. The Hawaiians thought these guys were fierce, and in fact they are. Actually, one of the nicknames for King Kamehameha was a puhi, an eel. So warriors were often called this, and I think this is just, in a second, he's going to do some really cool flips. It's insane how they can leverage their bodies against the reef and against the creature they're fighting. Like, it's absolutely incredible. And this poor octopus is hanging on for dear life, but he doesn't make it. That whole tying yourself in a knot thing is something that some deep sea fish also do when eating other elongated fishes do that are not related to morays. So apparently, if you're long and skinny, tie yourself in a knot to get some leverage to help pull against a struggling prey item. Another common behavior you can see with morays is them hanging out at cleaning stations or getting cleaned. This is a picture here in Hawaii. So we have a yellow-headed moray that's getting cleaned by some cleaner shrimp. And very often, if you're swimming along and you see some cleaner shrimp hanging around in the reef, don't just, stick your hand in there and try to get cleaned. Look first to see if there's an eel, because 9 times out of 10, there's an eel who's hanging out there with them as well. So that's a fun, common behavior that you guys can see if you know the location of some cleaning stations around the reef. Okay, so that's some background on morays, some cool facts. If you guys have any questions about that, percolating, feel free to ask, but now we're just gonna go through some identification. So first off, we have the Snowflake Moray, and the snowflake's nickname is the puhi kapa, and this guy has pebble teeth. They're called pebble teeth. So normally when you see a moray, you think of a moray who's got these really gnarly viper-looking teeth. These guys have little round bumpy teeth because they don't eat fish. They crush on rocks and, not rocks, but any hard shell crustaceans or mollusks. And actually today on my dive with Nanette, we saw a little snowflake eel who was out and about, and it looked like he was kind of digging in the sand and crunching on something. And you didn't see any big nasty teeth. It was just him going crush, 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 crush. This is also one of the few morays that change sex. So they all start off as females, and then they change sex to males. And unlike parrotfishes and wrasses, I don't know if there's any social structuring of it where the biggest female will turn into the male, and I don't think there's a way to tell them apart aside from cutting them open. But that's kind of an interesting thing. It is actually notoriously hard to find the sex of an eel. There was a whole long 100-year saga of figuring out how to sex some freshwater eels that were economically important in Europe. So there's no way by looking at an eel from the outside to tell whether one's male or female. You just have to watch them mating, I guess. Next, we've got a dragon moray, and this is a favorite of divers. How many of you have been lucky enough to see a dragon moray? I've seen one. Oh, very good. They're not very common at all, but they do tend to hang out in the same spot once you find one, and they're just so cool. You can really see, look at those in-current nostrils. Those are the little nostrils that are sticking out straight in front. So again, that's kind of emphasis on how important smell is for these guys, that they have these really big nostrils sticking out in front of their faces. The name of the dragon moray in Hawaiian is Puhi Kauila, which is named after the Kauila tree, and the bark of the tree is very dark and kind of has this mottled spotty pattern, kind of similar to the skin of the dragon moray. The zebra moray, another moray that you kind of see commonly, he also has pebble teeth, which means that he's not eating fish, he's eating little hard-shelled guys, and he also changes sex from female to male. So we've got the zebras and the snowflake morays, both have the pebble teeth and both change sex. And from what I know, those are the only guys who do that. So, and they're not even closely related, so I'm not entirely sure why they do that. It's kind of a wonderful mystery.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, what do we got?
Are the horns on the dragon moray, is that the outgoing, are those the outgoing of his nose?
No, I don't think so. I can't quite see them on this picture, but I think they're kind of halfway between the in-current nares and those little horns. I think those are just for kind of a threat display. Apparently, a male dragon moray will really perk those up and puff out his dorsal and anal fins and make himself look really big with those. I don't know specifically why they evolved them and why they're the only ones that we have here who have those little horns, but I don't think they are the excurrent nares. If you want to smell things, you really only need the in-current ones to be big, right? The excurrent ones being big doesn't really do you much good. If the in-current ones are big, they can get more in. Excurrent, just somewhere for it to come out, for all that water you pumped in to come out. All right, Yellowmargin Moray. This is gnarly. This is a gnarly eel. This is typically what their heads look like. They're called Yellowmargin because if you are lucky enough to see one out and swimming, or you see one's tail wrapping around the reef, they've got this bright yellow band along the top of their fins, their dorsal and anal fins. And that's why they're the Yellowmargin. His head they can get quite big. And This is the typical face of the yellow margin, very brown and yellows. And his name is Puhipaka because he is a fierce eel. They were in old Hawaii. If you were fishing for these guys, you were likely to lose a toe as you were trying to fish them. And as we're talking about eel fishing in Hawaii, there were a couple different methods to fish for eels. You have, let's see, hold on. You have nets, you have traps, you have spears, and you have hook and line. And these guys were likely, if you tried to dangle food in front of them on hook and line, they would just swallow the whole hook and snap your line or snap your fishing rod. They're really strong fish, so tricky to catch. And another side note, how you would catch little baby eels is, hold on one second, let me see if I can get me on the big screen. So if you can see me, what would happen is you would hold a squid in your hand and you would dangle the squid tentacles in between your fingers. And you would put your hand on a rock and you'd put that whole thing in front of a place where there were some baby eels that are hanging out. And the baby eels would come and they'd nip on the tentacles of the squid. And once you had a bunch biting on the squid tentacles, you'd pull the squid back so that the little eels were now in your hand, and you go like this. And then you'd have caught 4 different eels. And if you did that with eels that were too big, your hand would be bitten off. So you had to be careful who you chose for that. Or if you accidentally thought there were only a couple eels in here, let me hang this squid in my hand, you could screw up big time with that. So hunting eels was stereotypically a man's thing to do. And it was also something that was very like warrior-like and respected. All right, going back to my screen here. Oh, sorry guys. Hold on one second. See, Rachel, when I try a new screen share, it just doesn't work. Okay. No, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry guys. Hold on one second again. There we go. Everyone with the eels again? Sweet. Sorry about that, guys. Thank you. Moving on. Dwarf Moray. Karen, sorry, could you put yourself on
Goldie out there, could you send her in?
There we go. All right, dwarf morays. These guys are the smallest morays on the reef, and a lot of people ask me if they're babies, but the adults themselves are really tiny. So here in this picture, you can kind of see from the scale of the other stuff on the reef and from the coral in front how small this guy is, but that's an adult. And the dwarf moray is the only moray I've ever seen fighting with each other. And I wasn't sure at the time if they were fighting or mating, but I think they were fighting now that I've known what mating is. There was 2 of them, and they were completely tangled in the biggest eel knot you could imagine. And they were just rolling around on the bottom, just tangled up and biting at each other. And it is hard to tell sometimes if it is an aggressive behavior or a mating behavior, but I'm pretty sure it was just 2 kind of disputing a territory. One looked like an older guy, so it might have been kind of a young whippersnapper moving in and trying to usurp the king as it goes. Next, we've got the Whitemouth Moray. This is the most common moray eel that I see on the reef, so named for his bright white mouth, so that's the main identifying feature of this guy. And Hawaiian name for him is Puhi Oni O, which means the spotted eel, because he has those spots. This is one of the few eels that you'll see hunting during the daytime. So really fun to watch for hunting behaviors. He's who you will see doing the cooperative hunting. So if you're out there and you see a trumpetfish who's kind of circling an area or a jack who's circling an area, you know if you go over there, you're gonna see an eel because that's cooperative hunting behavior. And it's pretty much always a whitemouth moray who they're hunting with. Yellowheaded Moray is the guy that I have here in my background, and he's called that because he's got a bright yellow head, and he can be easily confused with the Undulated Moray because under the water, his head also kind of looks yellow. His is a little greener, and if you notice, the pattern on his body is it's almost painted, spotty, like imagine using a sponge when you're painting a wall or on a painting. The yellow-headed moray, you can't quite see on his body, but he has more bars, pretty distinct dark and light bars going down his body. It's a much calmer pattern than this guy. And his name is Puhi Laumilo, which is the Milo leaf eel, and it could be that that's how he was cooked. A lot of eels, there are instructions on how to cook them young or old, wrapped in certain kinds of leaves and cooked over the fire for certain amounts of time. And so that could be the connection with that leaf. I'm not quite sure. The Stout Moray is, according to the books, one of the most common morays that we have. I don't see them very often because they're very shy. So they like to live in shallow waters, so they're great for divers and snorkelers alike. And they look kind of similar to the white-spotted morays, or the Whitemouth morays, but they don't have those really distinct white spots. They're kind of more of a scrambled looking texture. But their color can vary quite dramatically. So you can have someone who, you see how he's light and dark, where that light-dark pattern is reversed, or he's much more dark or much more light. So a kind of a shy eel tends to be in shallower waters and has that kind of scribbly pattern on him and no white mouth. That's going to be your Stout Moray. So I encourage you guys, next time you're out, keep an eye out for these guys. I'm definitely going to try to look harder because I know that they're more common than I think they are. They're just a little, they like to hide away. The last two morays I'm going to talk about is the tiger snake moray versus the large spotted snake moray. Both are relatively uncommon. How many of you guys have seen one or what you think might be one or two of these guys? Yeah? Okay. Well, Bruce doesn't know. I know, Mike, you were recently talking about whether or not it was a tiger or a large spotted snake, because they both look kind of similar. The main difference is looking at the excurrent nares, the nostrils that are higher up on the head. The large spotted snake morays are much more bulbous than the tiger snake morays. So that is an identifying feature for these guys. Also, the tiger snake moray, you might say, why is he called tiger? Because he's got spots, not like a tiger. Tiger has stripes. I'm not entirely sure why he's named Tiger, but I know he's very fierce. They're known to eat other eels and go after them. Lanita, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm always joking with Michelle about, oh, I saw so many snakes when we went diving. And then she goes, they were eel, they're not snakes. And we go back and forth. Why do these have the word snake in their name? Michelle? Sorry. Okay, I'm just curious.
It's good, and we're going to come to a group of eels that are called snake eels. It's just so you have different families within the morays because there are so many species of morays. Snake morays is a group, and so if we go back, let's see, if we go all the way back to my picture of the moray eel, going back here, you can see his dorsal fin and his anal fin, they're really long. The dorsal fin comes all the way up to his head, and the anal fin goes halfway up his body. On snake morays, that dorsal anal fin is confined way to the back of the fish. So if we look again, you might not be able to see on these guys, but you can. You don't see that dorsal fin coming all the way up to their head. It stays way back. So because of that, they do look more snake-like, right? Because they don't have that big dorsal anal fin. So yes, if you were going to call anyone a snake, you'd call these guys a snake. But if you're seeing lots of these guys, holy cow, where are you diving? Because I don't see a lot of them at all. All right, moving on to our next group of eels, we've got conger eels and garden eels. And again, kind of the generic names for these guys are puhi. These guys are also elongated, but one difference between them and the morays is they do have small pectoral fins. Morays do not. Congers are typically hidden by day, and they hunt at night. That's only when I've seen them, and in the daytime I've kind of seen their tails sticking out of holes, but they're not out, you know. Garden eels, they live in little burrows and colonies, and they really like currents. So we're going to talk about where we see some of these. And all of the species that I'm going to talk about today are endemic. So for some reason within this group, a lot of them are endemic or only found here. So first off, we've got the Hawaiian Conger. If you see a big looking eel that is gray and has those pectoral fins, that's going to be a Hawaiian Conger. There's no one else who looks like him. And this one actually looks kind of old. His eyes, if you notice, they're not very prominent, right? He hunts at night. He's not relying on his vision a lot to catch fish. And I have actually seen these guys out and swimming about at night. And actually, if you're doing a night dive and there's a conger eel who's swimming along beside you, he is in fact following you and hunting by your light. So the only time I've seen anybody eat at night was a conger eel snap up a squirrelfish who was out swimming at the nighttime as well. So they're kind of fun to see when you do get to see them. The large eye conger is a really overlooked fish. They look like this. You don't see much more of the large eye conger than this. His little head just poking out of the sand. And again, you only see these guys at night. And if you get close, they'll kind of retreat back into their little sand den. So if you are on a night dive, or next time you're out at night, go and spend some time over the sand. And if you see any fish who looks like he's just, fairly good size, but poking out of the sand, that's going to be your large eye conger. And again, he's endemic to Hawaii. Next, we've got the Hawaiian Garden Eels. So these guys I see out at Molokini Crater at depths typically 60 feet plus. And some shore dives, you can see them as well. They live in colonies, as you can see. And on studies on other garden eels, not the Hawaiian ones, they're found to have about 2.3 eels per square meter. So they're pretty well spread out. And when researchers were trying to catch them and inspect them, if you pulled them out of their hole and even let their tail, just the edge of their tail, touch the sand again, they would wiggle their way back in the sand. So they're really good at swimming backwards to dig back into the sand. Typically, you find them in large groups, in big colonies. And again, this hasn't been found in the Hawaiian ones. I don't think there's been the research on the Hawaiian ones, but on other garden eels, you'll have typically dominant males live in the center and less dominant males live on the edge of the group. And when it becomes close to spawning season, you'll see them kind of pair up. So you'll have two that live really close to each other, and their spawning is not as quick as the moray eels. Apparently, they'll come all the way out and kind of tangle up and stay that way for up to 9 hours, just hanging out in the open like that. So I don't spend a lot of time out at Molokini where I can see these guys, but that would be something really, really cool to notice. They're kind of fun to watch because they stick their heads out and they'll pick certain food that they like out of the water column. So here we can see these are not Hawaiian garden eels, but another species of garden eel, and how far out they can come from their little burrows. But also, as soon as you get close, they kind of hide away back in. And I mentioned that they do like current. You can always tell which direction a current is going if there is one, because all the garden eel heads will be pointed into that current, because they feed off of little guys floating in the water column. So if they're pointing into the current, they've got food just flying into their mouths, which is pretty sweet. Okay, so those are our garden eels and conger eels. Next group of eels are the snake eels. So there we go, Lanita. The scientific name for these guys is serpent fish, because they look so snake-like, as you can see. And this is a magnificent snake eel. And as you can see, they don't have really long dorsal or anal fins. They do have tiny little pectoral fins as well, which is a difference from an actual snake. So if you were in a place that had water snakes and you saw pectoral fins, have no fear, it's just a snake eel. If you didn't see any pectoral fins, then it's probably a snake. You'd also look for scales. These guys don't have any prominent scales. This is probably the coolest snake eel out there, objectively. This is the Henshaw's snake eel, and I think this one's name is Gatorade. So when they do show up, they hang around in the same place for a while, and we get to name them. And they just sit like that. Their little heads sticking out of the sand, and they're voracious predators. So this is just the head of the animal. The rest of the body goes quite a distance into the sand, and they're really thick around. When there is a snake eel hanging out, you will find a graveyard of bones sticking out of the sand around them. Like, what is this? One time I found a cornetfish who was cut in half, and some of his insides had been eaten. But you pick up this head of this long cornetfish, and then you find the tail of this long cornetfish, and you're like, there's got to be a Henshaw snake eel somewhere around here. And the fact that this eel could drag a big, long cornetfish into the sand and try to eat it was very impressive. So these guys are really fun to see. They were discovered initially in Hawaii and thought to be endemic for a long time, but they're actually found also in the Indo-Pacific. So it's kind of cool that they're found here first, and they're named after a guy who was a relatively famous biologist in Oahu, I think, Mr. Henshaw. The freckled snake eel is endemic, and this is as much as you're going to see of him most of the time. He kind of sits in the sand and just breathes. I have a video of him later, and he's kind of just fun to watch. And if you get close, he will duck back into the sand, and you can actually see him swimming backwards in the sand from the surface. He'll leave this little valley of sand that collapses after his little tunnel that he dug through. So they're kind of fun you watch them duck down, you follow that little trail of collapsed sand, and then see where they're gonna pop right back up. And he's like, how'd you know where I was gonna be? And you're like, well, you left a little trail in the sand. So if you do come across a piece of sand that has a lot of little squiggly trails in the sand, and you're like, who came here and drew all these squiggly trails in the sand? Look around for a freckled snake eel, because chances are he's swimming around his territory. Okay, moving on to trumpetfishes. So trumpetfish, this is the only, there's one trumpetfish. It's not like with moray eels where there are many. And the scientific name for trumpetfish is Aulostomidae. And aulos means flute, and stoma means mouth. So the scientific name is actually flute mouth fish, even though we call them the trumpetfish. And the Hawaiian name is nunu, which fortunately doesn't mean like pipe organ mouth fish, because if we had 3 different instrument names for one fish, that would just be too much. So trumpetfishes are really accessible. They're one of the most common fish you're going to see out there, but also one of the weirdest, most common fish you're going to see out there. One of their defining features is that they're really good at camouflage. So here's a trumpetfish who is bright yellow because he's hanging out with a bunch of bright yellow millet seeds. And they're known for hanging out in big groups of fish, especially it looks like these millet seeds are going after a bunch of eggs that are hanging out on the bottom. He's probably sitting there hoping that one of the millet seeds is going to drop his guard for just a second, and he's going to suck them up. So typically, if you do have big groups of fish that come to feed excitedly on one spot, whether it's feeding on eggs or feeding on algae, there's a trumpetfish who's kind of lurking in the background, just waiting for someone to forget that he's there so that he can go ahead and eat someone. And they can camouflage to look like pretty much anything. I've seen a little baby who looked like a pencil urchin spine. He was hanging out in a pencil urchin. He was kind of reddish. So they can change their color and texture pattern to look like pretty much anything from yellows to browns to reds, mottled or not. They can also use that color change to signal aggression or mating behaviors. And like Rachel has in her background, unlike with the moray eels, these guys they have room to be able to expand their mouths, and they are really good suction feeders. That little mouth can expand quite a bit, quite quickly. And here's an awesome picture from Jenna of a trumpet that just caught somebody. It looks like maybe a squirrelfish to me, so the smaller fish. But if you ever do see that, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I've seen a coronet with a fish that was just caught in his mouth too. So seeing feeding behavior is really, really, really rare. This is probably just as rare, but honestly just as exciting. And it happens really quick. So here we've got, this is not Hawaii, but here's a trumpetfish. He's getting ready, he's getting ready, he's getting ready, and then bam, a snapper totally wasn't paying attention at the wrong second, and he's gone. So here we go again, trumpetfish getting ready, and head on, snapper totally in the mouth. So what he tries to do is position himself so the snapper is facing him, because he can't really swallow a fish broadsides. His mouth is long and not wide. So he waits until a fish is looking right at him, and that's when he goes for it. So imagine having to get your prey not only to not notice you enough that you can get really close, but not notice you enough that when he's looking right at you, he doesn't see you. And that's why the camouflage is so important for the trumpets, and that's why they're so skinny, because front on, they're really hard to see. Now this goes the opposite way, right? Eat or be eaten. When trumpetfish are big, there's kind of no one who will bother them, but when they're small, they can absolutely be lunch. So here we have a lizardfish who caught a younger trumpetfish, and the trumpet looks like he's trying to bend to make himself harder to swallow, But the young trumpets are definitely, as they're going around hunting, they have to kind of have eyes on the back of their head to make sure that they're not someone else's lunch while they're stalking their prey. It's a tricky life down there. One technique that they use to help sneak up on fish is called shadowing. Very often you see trumpetfish swim alongside other fish. Here we've got a parrotfish and a surgeonfish. They'll swim along porcupine fish. They'll swim along turtles. They'll kind of just try to pretend they're not there, right? And hide behind other fish. And this is also where their camouflage can come in handy. If they're behind a yellow fish, they'll kind of turn a yellower color. And we'll see another example of that later. But that's another technique for them sneaking up. Moving on from trumpetfishes, last group that we're going to talk about are cornetfishes, and their scientific name is Fistulariidae. And if you're familiar with the medical fistula, all that fistula means is pipe. So with a medical fistula, it's just a connection between two organs, two things that shouldn't be connected in the body. So I think it's nice that he's not, wouldn't it be funny if the scientific name for him was trumpetfish? No, that wouldn't be funny, that would be terrible. So at least this one makes sense, and only one name is of an instrument. Hawaiian name is also Nunu, which is similar to, it's the same thing as the trumpetfishes. These guys are different because instead of hanging out vertically, they hang out horizontally. And they've got this tail that extends past the end of their body. They have this little, what is it called? Like a little whip tail that extends past their main tail fin, which is unique among the fishes. No one else has that little whip tail. And as Chris has behind him, they can change texture and color dramatically just by watching them. So one of the fun things to do is watch them if they're over some seagrass, and they'll kind of look, they'll ripple their colors along with the changing bottom beneath them. So they're a really fun fish to watch. And again, this is one of the fishes that I've seen with a fish. He had a little outline of a fish in his mouth and he was swimming around because he had just captured somebody. So they're kind of see-through, and it's fun in that way. Their eyes are also really beautiful, and they let you get really close. So it often seems like if a cornetfish is swimming one way and I'm swimming kind of perpendicular to him, he'll just stop, let me pass by, and then keep going on his original path. A lot of fish will kind of swim away from you or swim around you. He just kind of waits for you to do your thing and then continues doing his own thing. So they've got kind of a funky personality, and they are quite friendly in terms of letting you get really close to them and swim along with them. All right, so next we've got a pop quiz, guys. Rachel, what's your question?
Can you go back again and just show trumpetfish versus cornetfish?
Yes, so here's our cornet. Long, he's got that little bit coming off the back of his tail. If you can see, he's kind of pointy at both ends, right? If you think of that. The trumpetfish, going back here to this one, he's kind of boxy at both ends, and he likes to hang out vertically in the water. You will never see a cornetfish going vertical. You will see trumpetfishes hanging out horizontally, swimming around. The trumpetfish, they also have, if you can see on the back, they've got their dorsal and anal fins right next to the tail. That's how they swim. They kind of vibrate, you know, they flap those around in the water, and that's how they swim. Versus the coronets, let's keep going. They have pointier fins, right? And they can use their pectoral fins to help them swim around. Also, the coronets, one of the ways that they swim, they can use their little fins, but they'll also wiggle the back third of their body. So they don't wiggle their whole bodies like a moray eel does. It's just the back third of their tail that moves and helps propel them along through the water. Any other questions? Okay, so pop quiz, how the format works. If everyone could open up your chat, please. What we're going to do is I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, identify and switch to a fish. Go ahead and see if you can guess what kind of fish it is. Try to guess at least, is it a moray, is it a conger, is it a snake moray, trumpet, coronet? And we're going to start off with a bunch of pictures, and then we're going to move on to videos. So if you're ready, 1, 2, 3, identify. Nice. Zebra moray. You can kind of imagine, like I said, he has pebble teeth. I think the ones with pebble teeth look like little gnarled old men from a front-on view because they don't have the big kind of fangs. So I think that's just a very cute face. Good job. He's an easy one to identify. Next one in 3, 2, 1. It is a moray. He's super tiny. This is our dwarf moray. And this one, again, you can kind of see some more of the detail in the foreground and the background, how tiny he is. This is an adult. And you can also kind of, a tip that he's a moray is those really long in-current nares, right? You don't normally get to see them, but this is a really close-up picture. All right, next one in 3, 2, 1, identify. Not quite sure about his resemblance to an owl, John, but that's okay. Freckled snake eel, right? So, yep, so this guy is an endemic, and again, this is commonly how you're gonna see him hanging out in the sand, breathing really fast. Okay, next one in 3, 2, 1, identify. Nice, guys. Henshaw's snake eel, not the prettiest face around. So he's not a moray, Michelle, because he's got pectoral fins. You can't see them. And you also don't see, notice you don't see those really big in-current nares. Nothing's poking out in front of his nose for the water to come in, which is a place, something that morays tend to have more than snake eels. Next one in 3, 2, 1, identify. Bye, John. Thanks for tuning in. Nice, guys. You guys are solid on your eels. I don't think I needed to do this class. Whitemouth Moray. There we go. Perfect. Next one in 3, 2, 1. This one's tricky. You don't get to see a lot of them. Nice, guys. Yellowmargin Moray. Cool. So he's a little different than the conger eel. The conger tends to be more gray, and you can see the kind of mottled pattern on his body that wouldn't be present on a conger eel. And again, those really big in-current and the ex-current nares, you can see them just above his eyes. That's how far apart they are. That's, again, a thing that you're going to see more prominent in morays. All right, next one in 3, 2, 1. This one's tricky. We didn't talk about this guy. Well, let's see if you can put him in a group. Nice. It is a moray. He does have pebble teeth, right? If you look really close, he's got those little bumpy teeth, right? He doesn't have any sharp fang-looking things. So he's a little mollusk eater, not a fish eater. And this is a barred moray. So good job, Mike and Janet. He's really, really, really shy. I have seen a couple of these guys, but just their little eyes hiding in the reef. So you're not going to see much more of them than that. And I wonder, so I made the connection between the Snowflake Moray and the Zebra Moray, who also have the pebble teeth, and how they change sex from female to male. I wonder if these guys do the same thing. I don't know. They're not commonly seen, so I don't think a lot is known about them. All right, next one in 3, 2, 1. Video time. Nice. Yeah. So this is what our freckled snake eel looks like when he's actually sitting there breathing. So you can see him from a little distance away from the little cloud of dust that he's picked up. Nice. Freckled snake eel. Good job. Next one in, go. Not the octopus, the fish. So he comes in. Notice how he's swimming with like the back third of his body. Nice. So cornetfish. Good job, everybody. Next one in 3, 2, 1. Identify. Ooh, this one's. It's without the extra O. I always spelled it coronet, but I think it's just cornet. Yeah. This one is a nice, easy identification. Bonus points if you can tell me what he's doing. What is this behavior called? Yes, shadowing. Nice. So here, I don't know if he's doing a very good job at shadowing. I'm not sure if he's aware that he's bright yellow and he's not shadowing a bright yellow fish. So I don't know how actually effective that is. But that is, again, one of the really common behaviors you're going to see, and the surgeonfish doesn't seem to mind him at all. Next one in 3, 2, 1. Mm-hmm. Nice. So this one's a little tricky because you can't quite see the really identifying feature of him, which is his bright white mouth. But this is a Whitemouth Moray. And this is kind of typical. You'll see Whitemouth Morays of this size. And this is him hunting about during the daytime. And you can see he's a little blundery. He's a little uncoordinated. And that's probably because he can't see very well. So how you can tell who he is yes, he's got a bright white spot on the tail. That's a good identifying feature of the whitemouth from behind. And he's also got those very clear white speckles on his body, which is unique to the whitemouth. Eels are fishes. Yes, they're in the ray-finned fish category, even though they lost a lot of their fins. All right, next one in 3, 2, 1. Lanita, you look like you would love to meet this guy. So you can see why these guys are called fierce. Yeah, you wouldn't want one of those swimming after you if your little toesies were dangling in the water. No, thank you. So this is our Undulated Moray. So he looks kind of similar to the Yellowheaded Moray, who's right next to me, because he's got a lighter color on his head, but it's more green than yellow. And his body pattern is very busy. It looks like somebody took a sponge and dipped it in brown paint and sponged it onto a white wall. And they are also one of the fish that you'll see out hunting during the daytime. I'm not sure why he's over the sand here. He could just be kind of traveling from one reef to another. But you're actually quite lucky if you get to see him. All you have to do to not get bit is, don't stick anything out in front of him, especially not a squid in your hand. Next one in 3, 2, 1. That's it. Excellent job, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate all of you. Next week, we're going to branch out from fishes and go into invertebrates, but the favorite group of invertebrates, the cephalopods. So octopus and squid and cuttlefish.